Hi, just a relatively short video here, talking you through the grading process this summer for GCSEs and A Levels. It's to support really our centre policy, which is on the school website, but maybe isn't that easy to understand, so I'm going to talk you through the main points. And the things I'm going to cover is just a little bit about why we chose the structure we did for assessments. And then once you've completed all those assessments, what we're going to do to go about awarding your grades, which I guess is the thing you're most interested in. And then a little bit about what we're going to do to make things fair for everyone, to avoid bias from teachers towards students. I need to talk you through a few examples of malpractice from a few different perspectives, and then also some information about the appeals process. But on that, there'll be a lot more to follow later because it's a bit too much detail to go through. So when we come into the assessment structure, obviously we had to decide how long we were going to assess you over and the number of assessments. Now, when it comes to the length of the assessment period, you will know that you've had about 10 weeks of assessments or so by the end of it, much longer than a normal exam season, which would be 4 to 5 weeks. So I wanted to explain to you why we did that. From the outset, we wanted to be sure that if any of you had to self-isolate, as some of you had to do right at the very beginning, that if it was a short exam period, it would be really seriously affected by 2 weeks out of school, whereas over a longer exam period, it wasn't so severely affected. And also, by starting before Easter, it meant that should anything have gone wrong, health-wise or anything after Easter, we already had some data to start deciding on the grades that we should give you. It also meant we could have a larger number of assessments, which I'll come to in a minute in a bit more detail. And it did mean that we could do lessons in timetabled lessons rather than having you all together in the hall, which obviously poses problems with social distancing and that sort of thing. But also what that would have meant was we couldn't really have carried on teaching you. We would have had to either have lessons going on where lots of you weren't there, and so the people who were present got loads of support from upcoming assessment, the people who weren't didn't get that support, which seemed unfair. Or we would have just had to say, right, we're not going to teach you, you're just going to study by yourselves for this period of weeks. And that didn't seem sensible, bearing in mind the disruption you've had this year, bearing in mind we still want to sort of continue with your learning and prepare you for A levels or whatever it is you're doing after this. So by having the sort of longer assessment period, it meant we could structure things in a way we could carry on teaching you up until May half term. Now, the number of assessments, yes, you've had more, and that was intentional. You may think that's a bit cruel, but it was intentional. The reason for that, well, there were a few reasons. If you screwed one up and didn't do particularly well, if you only had 2 assessments in a subject, that's really significant. If you have a lot of assessments in a subject, then performing poorly on one doesn't really damage your grade to the same extent. So we felt that that was a fairer way for you to have the assessments. And also, should you have missed one, and it seemed likely that people would miss things with the level of self-isolation that was going on at the time the assessment started, if you did miss one, again, it wasn't as critical. We still had lots of other evidence to assess you on. And then there was another aspect to it as well. Because of the disruption you've had to your education, perhaps you haven't achieved the same amount of long-term learning as you might have normally, and therefore you're faced with having to really revise a lot of work from a year or 2 ago in a short space of time. Well, by having more assessments with each one shorter and on less material, then what that means is that it's easier to achieve that sort of short-term burst learning, that taking the time now to sort of go back and try and refresh your mind about things that were done maybe 2 years ago is more achievable if you've got a shorter assessment on a smaller amount of material rather than a fewer number but longer assessments each on more material. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of the assessment period now. It's not too long before you have finished them all. So how are we going to go about deciding on your grades? Well, we're going to do it in 2 stages, and I'll talk you through both of those. But the 2 stages are basically, first one, using the data we've collected since you returned on March the 8th, and then just using the data we held from before March the 8th, perhaps mock exams, that sort of thing, just as a check. So, The reason we are primarily basing the grade you're getting on the data we've collected since March the 8th is that all of you have known those assessments are important. I feel it's a little bit unfair to go back to students and say, right, there was an exam you did 6 months ago that you didn't think was going to count towards your final grade because you were going to have exams this summer, and suddenly we're going to use that mock exam to determine your grade. That feels unfair to me. So initially we're going to decide what grade we think you should get based on the data we've collected since March the 8th. For those assessments, you've also been given support to prepare. You've all done the same assessments as each other. You've all been given the same support as each other in the lessons. And so therefore we're trying to get that consistency across all the people in the subject, all the students in the subject, so that they are all completing the same assessments with the same support, and it's sort of a level playing field. And largely, self-isolation hasn't disrupted these. I know there were some of you who did have to sort of go home immediately after we returned once you had your lateral flow tests results back, but typically it hasn't had a huge effect. And those people who it has affected, we've got really accurate records in this time. We've made sure we've collected that data and stored it, and we'll be able to take it into account during the grading process. And so that's why we're initially going to base the data on base grade on data we've collected since March the 8th. And what we will do to try and achieve that is we will combine the scores from all of your assessments, and then what's different to the initial process we were given last year, the grades we award to the year group this year aren't determined by the grades that the school have achieved, or students in the school have achieved in previous years. What's different about this year is, rather than saying this is the number of grades you can award, what we have been given are descriptors. And once we've combined all of your scores from all your assessments into one score, we've then got to use the descriptors to decide whereabouts our grade boundaries are going to go, whereabouts you are going to, what the grade that you are going to get based on the work that you have produced. So we'll have your portfolios of work, we'll have the grade descriptors, and using that we'll have to decide which students get which grade. But it's not predetermined by the results of previous year groups. It is quite a difficult process, it's quite a long process, and that's why we have had to put in an extra inset day into the school year. The first Monday back after half term, we're having an extra inset day in order to give your teachers, the subject leaders, time to go through that process as thoroughly as they need to. So that's stage one, and they will do that on that inset day. And then once they've done that, then we will consider the data that we've got from assessments you did before March the 8th. They might be things like mock exams. Now really we're going to use those as a safety net. So it might be that that data has absolutely no effect on the grade that you get given. Really what we'll be doing is saying, okay, what grade have we initially decided each student should get? Are there any students where that grade seems particularly low, based on what we knew already about you? Do we have compelling evidence to say actually it should be higher? They have really underperformed in these assessments since March the 8th, and therefore we'll raise the grade. And typically it will be used in that positive way as evidence to say actually the student should get a higher grade than the one that we've originally determined. It may have absolutely no bearing on your grade, and we don't intend to use it in a negative way to say they performed really well but they weren't doing so well before, so we'll downgrade it. As I said, it's more like a safety net that we're looking to use in a positive way. Okay, so I need to talk to you a little bit about how we're going to make things fair, how we're going to make sure that a teacher's opinion of you as a person, or their preconceived ideas about what grade you should get, making sure that that doesn't affect the grade that you get. So the first thing you'll know is that we've got candidate numbers on your papers, and we haven't got your names. And then in the grading process on the inset day, the process will be carried out by candidate number again. So when the work is being looked at, you'll have your candidate number on. the spreadsheet that your grade that's being awarded will be entered in just has your candidate number on, and so your name doesn't come into the process for us grading, and therefore it can't influence the grade that you are given. The marking isn't necessarily being done by your teacher, and it's not even that we're saying this class's papers are all going to be marked by one teacher. A variety of teachers are typically involved in the marking, but they are just going to get a random assortment of papers. So again, they don't know which class they're marking, they don't know if the students from their class or a different class. Their views on what students are capable of shouldn't affect the way that the scripts are marked. And then obviously what we have to do is we have to standardise our marking. And it's being done differently in different subjects. So there are various methods that are being used, and this is basically to try and make sure that whoever marks the paper, they mark it to the same sort of level of strictness, if you like. They're as generous as each other or as harsh as each other. So a common way of doing that is that all of the people, all of the teachers involved in marking a certain assessment meet together before they mark them. And a sample of scripts of different levels are sort of marked together, and they discuss the marking, and they discuss the mark scheme, and they agree what they're going to accept and what they're not going to accept. And once that meeting has taken place, they then go away and they start marking, and then shortly after the process has started, scripts that they've marked are sampled and checked by other members of the team to make sure that they have achieved that level of consistency they were after. A second way that's being used is that the scripts are randomised, they're sent out to different teachers, the teachers mark them, and then after they've been marked, that sort of checking process has gone through, moderation, it takes place, they decide on whether the marking has been accurate or too generous or too harsh, and then if necessary changes can be made to bring all of the marking from the different teachers into line, so there's no discrepancies there. And a final way is that, for example, in an assessment that maybe has 4 questions on it, that question 1 is marked entirely by one teacher for all of the people in the year group, question 2 a different teacher, and so on, and therefore you haven't got a variation in which teacher's marking question 1. Question 1 is marked to the same level of harshness or generosity for everyone because it's marked by the same teacher. So they're really the different ways that we're going about trying to standardise the marking and make sure it doesn't matter who marks your paper gets the mark it deserves based on the quality of your responses. Now, malpractice. So things that we have to report to the exam board for them to consider in the process if things haven't been done correctly. So typically for us as a school, we could be guilty of malpractice, and the main way really is not following the policy that we've laid out that's available on our website and not sticking to what we've said we're going to do. There's all sorts of things in there, but I guess the main things that I think I should point out to you is that it would be malpractice if we as a school awarded a grade that wasn't supported by the evidence that we've got. We have to retain the evidence we've got. It may be examined by the exam boards, and if you felt that we'd given a grade that really couldn't be supported by the evidence we had on you, you could suggest that we're guilty of malpractice, and that's something that could be investigated. And then the other thing is, if we just said to the teachers, oh, decide the grade and we'll submit it, we can't do that. We have to take sufficient steps. So after that inset day that happens on the first day after half term, we've then got 2 weeks of meetings to go through each subject's grades to make sure that the evidence is there to support them, to make sure they've gone through all the processes that we said that we would go through, and to make sure that we followed our policy. So they're really the main ways that I think are of interest to you, and typically that we as a school could be guilty of malpractice. For you, it's nothing that you wouldn't really expect. Any cheating in the assessments, any use of mobile phones or that sort of thing, that would be an example of malpractice. Also, because we're in a slightly different situation, you've got sometimes people doing assessments at different times. If you were to share the details of an assessment with other students, that would be malpractice. And then one that's really specific to this year, and we haven't had any examples of this yet, and I hope that we won't, but we have been asked to report examples or cases where students have tried to pressure their teacher into giving them a grade. Now, I'm not saying, you know, don't communicate with your teacher and don't ask them what's coming up in an assessment and that sort of thing, but this is more about that sort of trying to apply pressure and saying to the teacher, I need this grade and you need to give me this grade. As I say, I haven't had any examples of that reported to me so far this year. I hope we don't have any examples of that, and it's sort of wouldn't normally happen in exam season because we're not responsible for awarding the grades in that case, but this year we are. And then actually as well, the same applies to pressure from parents. Again, it's not a ban on parents communicating with teachers and perhaps sort of informing us of circumstances in your family or outside of school that they're worried have affected your performance in assessments. You know, if they have those concerns, they're welcome to let us know, and I'd encourage them to do that. It's more about that parents getting in touch with your teachers and trying to again apply that pressure to say, my child needs this grade, you should be giving them this grade. You know, the situation should be that neither the students or the parents interfere in that process. Okay, finally, the appeals process. There's too much to go through here. There's basically some forms that you have to fill out and some steps that you have to follow, and we'll share those with you before the last week of term, before the last week of your assessments, so that you've got them in good time. But I'll talk you through roughly what the process is going to be. So we will share with you a list of all of the pieces of data we're going to use in each subject in order to determine your grade. And if you have any concerns about any of those pieces of data, if there was something going on in your life that meant when you did that assessment you really don't think you performed as well as you could, and you know, we've got evidence to support that, then you can let us know about that and we can try and take that into account in the grading process. So that's what you can do before the grading process, and as I say, that's before June 7th, I think it is, the inset day, the first Monday that you would have had back after half term. Okay, once the results are published in August, then there will be a form available for you to complete on results day or shortly after results day if you feel you want to appeal. And the first stage is you appeal to us as a school. And we're quite limited here. We can only check whether we've done something wrong with our procedure, we haven't followed our procedure, or perhaps we've just made an administrative error, perhaps entered the wrong grade. So if we discover either of those two things, then we can contact the exam board and say, we have made an error, the correct grade should be this, the grade needs to be changed. But they're the only things that we as a school can do to change your grade. I have to point out to you that if you did appeal and we found we made an administrative error in your favour and we should have given you a lower grade, we would have to report the lower grade. So your grade might go up, it might go down, it might stay the same. We will then let you know the outcome of that and give you the opportunity to trigger the second stage of the appeals process. And if you ask us to, then we have to trigger that process and we have to submit the appeal on your behalf to the exam board. So it's not a case of you submitting the appeal to the exam board, it's us, you tell us to do it, we are then obliged. We don't have any choice, we have to then submit that appeal to the exam board. And the way that we're going to design our form is there'll be enough information on that form for us to do it straight away. So we won't have to just get back to you and say, bring this form in and make it difficult. It'll just be a case of you saying, trigger stage 2 of the appeal process, please, and us doing it. We will then send the appeal to the exam board. We will have to send them any evidence that we have got to support that grading decision, and then the exam board will decide whether your grade should be changed, and we have no control over that part of the process. So it will be the exam board's decision. They might decide to keep your grade the same, they might decide we've been too harsh and it should be a higher grade, they might decide the other way, and they might decide to lower your grade, and then that will be the appeals process over, and they will inform you of the outcome of your appeal. Okay, but as I said, there'll be more information sent to you so that you're fully informed about how to go about doing that and the ins and the outs of it. It's just a bit too much to go to in this video here. Okay, so that's it really. I hope that's put your mind at rest if you had any concerns about the grading process. I hope it's explained why you've had this long 10-week assessment period. I genuinely think, I'm not saying it hasn't been stressful because I know it has, but I genuinely think it's probably put less of a burden in terms of stress and anxiety on you than you would have had if you'd had 4 to 5 weeks of long, intense exams. You might find that difficult to believe, but I think it is the case. So I hope you understand why we went about that, and then I hope also to have sort of just reassured you that we're going to take all the steps we should to make sure you get the grade you deserve to get, and that if you don't feel you've got the grade you deserve to get, there is a way for you to appeal that grade and to take that forward. So thanks very much for your patience. It's been a little bit longer than I'd anticipated. I'm just looking down, it's been about 20 minutes. If you have any other questions, please do speak to myself or Mr. Abood and we'll try to answer them.